All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a story that completely rewrites early American history. I'm talking about a narrative that's been buried for centuries, totally overshadowed by the standard textbook tales we all grew up with. But finally, it's stepping into the light, and it is absolutely fascinating. So think about early American exploration for a second. Chances are you're picturing European conquistadors, right? Guys in heavy armor planting flags in the sand. But if we really want to understand the very earliest days of global contact here, we have to look past those traditional stories and ask ourselves a totally different question. The answer to that question? It's Mostafa Azzemouri. He was a Moroccan explorer, and his massive journey across the Americas actually happened way before many of the famous European expeditions. I mean, long before the English settled Jamestown or the Pilgrims ever thought about Plymouth Rock, Mustafa was out there literally walking thousands of miles across the completely unexplored heart of North America. To really get how he ended up there, we've got to start at the beginning. His story kicks off in the ancient Moroccan city of Azzemour, where he was born right around 1503. But things took a really tragic turn in 1522. He was just a teenager when he was ripped from his home, captured, and enslaved by the Portuguese. Eventually, he was sold in a Spanish slave market to a nobleman named Andrés Durance de Carranza. Now, what's kind of wild to look at here is his long list of names. It really reflects the sheer diversity of the cultures he interacted with and the massive legacy he left behind. The Spanish called him Estevanico or Esteban de Durantes. Other folks knew him as Le Noir, the Arabophone, or Stephen the Black. It's like every culture that crossed his path tried to define him. But as we're going to see, Mustafa was very much a guy who defined himself. So as an enslaved man, Mustafa was forced onto the infamous Panfilo de Narvaez expedition. The big goal? Conquer Florida and the surrounding areas. But let me tell you, this trip turned into an absolute nightmare almost immediately. They leave Cuba in 1528 and boom, they're battered by hurricanes. They're forced to land near present-day Tampa. The commander decides to split the group, sending 300 guys marching north. No safe harbor anywhere, just hostile encounters, terrible starvation, and eventually a violent storm that literally shattered their makeshift boats off the coast of Galveston, Texas. Which brings us to the staggering number, 4. Out of the hundreds of heavily armed, well-supplied men who kicked off this grand conquest, only 4 guys survived that brutal journey along the Gulf Coast. And yep, one of those incredibly resilient survivors was Mustafa. But here's the thing. Instead of just giving up in the brutal aftermath of that shipwreck, Mustafa adapted. From 1529 to 1534, he and the other survivors were actually enslaved by the Coahuiltecan people down in Texas. Mustafa didn't just sit there, though. He used that time to observe. He learned. He developed this incredible grasp of local indigenous medicine, which obviously made him incredibly valuable. By 1534, the 4 of them pulled off an escape. They used their new medical knowledge to trade for food, shelter, and safe passage from village to village, until they somehow, miraculously, made it to Mexico City in 1536. This right here is just a brilliant illustration of 2 totally different approaches to exploration. You've got the traditional European style, driven by military force, hostility, taking what isn't theirs, which, frankly, doomed that first expedition. And then on the flip side, you have Mustafa's method. Records show the guy was a phenomenal polyglot. He mastered at least 6 Native American languages in just a handful of years. He didn't conquer, he communicated. He was a healer, a guide, and this indispensable cultural interpreter. Professor Abdeslam El-Idrisi really hits the nail on the head here, noting that Mustafa served as a guide, negotiator, diplomat, translator, healer, and cultural bridge. He wasn't just some passive shipwreck survivor. He actively engaged with the Native Americans, talked with them, treated their sick, and earned their deep respect. People from local tribes would literally escort him from town to town because they valued his presence and his healing abilities that much. Okay, so he finally gets to Mexico City, and his unbelievable survival story, plus those insane linguistic skills, catches the attention of the top brass. The Spanish viceroy was totally obsessed with rumors of the 7 cities of Cibola. Think of it as a mythical El Dorado up north. So in 1539, the viceroy commissions a new expedition, but they need a guy who actually knows the land and the people. Enter Mustafa. Now operating as a free man, he's appointed as the lead guide. And that brings us to his final and honestly most mysterious mission. Mustafa takes a small scouting party of Sonoran natives and bravely heads out ahead of the main expedition.
His goal is to build good relationships with the locals before the Spanish army shows up. He makes it all the way to the ancient city of Howiku, which is in today's Zuni Indian Reservation in New Mexico. But this is exactly where the historical record just shatters into a million pieces. He disappears. And the circumstances? Highly, highly contested.
So we're left with this massive historical cliffhanger. When the Spanish finally arrived at the site later on, they claimed the villagers had confiscated Mustafa's stuff and killed him, and for centuries, that was just accepted as undisputed historical fact. But as modern researchers are digging back into these fragmented records, we gotta ask, is that really what went down? Well, historian Juan Francisco Mara proposes this thrilling alternative. The Mara theory suggests that Mustafa, a guy who just spent a decade surviving against all odds and deeply integrating with indigenous cultures, orchestrated the whole thing. Think about it. Why go back to a society that enslaved you? The theory argues he faked his own death to finally shake off Spanish rule and just live out his days peacefully among the native tribes he'd come to know and respect. And there's actually some really fascinating cultural evidence backing up this idea of profound integration. In the religious traditions of some local indigenous groups, there's a revered spirit figure called Chakwaina. A lot of historians and researchers strongly believe Chakwaina is a direct, lasting representation of Mustafa himself. He made such a positive, powerful impression as a healer that he basically entered their spiritual traditions and their hearts for good. Now, 5 centuries later, look at how his legacy spans across continents. Indigenous peoples are still keeping his memory alive through oral traditions and spiritual figures. For African Americans looking for historical roots beyond the dark circuits of slavery, Mustafa stands tall as this brilliant first pioneer on the continent. And back in his homeland of Morocco, he's celebrated as a truly distinguished explorer, basically on par with the legendary Ibn Battuta. His impact is literally still shaping diplomacy today. Moroccan ambassador Youssef Amrani points out that Mustafa's journey laid the very first cultural bedrock for the deep relationship we see between Morocco and the United States. Long before formal agreements like the 1786 Treaty of Peace and Friendship, you had a Moroccan man walking the American Southwest, building these incredible bridges of communication. So today, Mostafa Azzemouri is finally stepping out of the shadows. He was recently the focus of a major international conference right in his hometown of Azemmour. His legacy of cultural exchange is inspiring modern U.S.-Morocco Atlantic initiatives. And his life story is even the focus of Leila Lalami's amazing Pulitzer finalist novel, The Moor's Account, which does a beautiful job reclaiming his narrative for all of us today. I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder about America's first Moroccan explorer. We're talking about a man who crossed oceans in chains, survived hurricanes, mastered complex languages, and healed the sick. Did he really die a tragic death at the edge of the unknown back in 1539? Or did he pull off the greatest escape in early American history, finding true freedom by fading into the very cultures he came to understand so deeply? We might never know for sure, but his legacy, that is absolutely here to stay.